He was one of the richest, most feared men in the city, a titan of industry with a reputation forged in steel and shadow. But no amount of money could fix the silence in his sprawling mansion. Antonio Costello could command armies of lawyers and move markets with a whisper, yet he was powerless against the stillness that had claimed his son. After firing 7 of the country's top pediatric specialists and a dozen highly trained nurses, his hope had withered into a brittle, dangerous thing. The 8th doctor, an old family friend, simply managed the decline. His 10-year-old son, Luca, was a ghost in a high-tech bed, his vibrant life extinguished by the same tragic accident that had stolen his mother. Into this cathedral of grief walked 3 boys from the other side of the city, armed with nothing but a lug wrench and a startling lack of fear. They changed a tire on his armored sedan, their hands sure and quick, their faces smudged with the grime of a life he could barely imagine. And in the eyes of the eldest, a quiet, watchful teenager, Costello saw a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: competence untainted by pity. The next day, a black SUV slid to the curb outside their crumbling apartment building, a silent predator in a world of concrete and stray cats. It wasn't a threat, it was an offer that would lead the quiet boy into the heart of the mansion, where he would witness a tiny, impossible flicker of life in the eyes of the ghost child. What he saw that day would not only defy a medical certainty, but would unravel a secret so dark it would threaten to destroy them all, forcing a broken man to confront a truth more painful than his grief and breaking him completely, before he could ever be put back together. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The hiss of the flat tire was a final insulting punctuation mark on a day steeped in failure. Antonio Costello stood on the cracked pavement of a forgotten side street, the smell of hot asphalt and distant frying onions thick in the humid air. He wore a suit that cost more than the rusted-out cars lining the block, a silk and wool armor that felt absurdly out of place. His driver, a man built like a refrigerator, was on the phone, his voice a low, apologetic rumble. The spare was flat. A tow was an hour out, an hour. For a man whose every minute was invoiced in the thousands, it was an eternity. That's when he saw them. 3 boys emerging from the heat shimmer down the block like a mirage. They moved with the easy, loping grace of youth, a tightly knit unit. The youngest, maybe 12, was kicking a crushed soda can. The middle one, a bit broader in the shoulder, had a wary, challenging set to his jaw. And the eldest, tall and lean, walked with a quiet economy of motion, his eyes taking in everything, including the ridiculously expensive disabled car and the 2 men stranded beside it. They were black, and in this part of town, that fact combined with their age made them, to men like Costello's driver, a potential threat. Costello, however, saw something else. He saw the way the eldest brother, Marcus, put a subtle, calming hand on the middle one's shoulder as they approached. He saw the genuine curiosity in the youngest's eyes, not the avarice he was used to. "Got a flat?" the middle one, Jamal, asked, stopping a respectful distance away. His tone was direct, a little cocky. Costello's driver, Dimitri, took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the inside of his jacket. Costello raised a single finger, and Dimitri froze. "The spare is as useless as the tire," Costello said, his voice a low rasp. He wasn't accustomed to speaking to strangers on the street. He wasn't accustomed to being on the street. The youngest, Leo, peered at the shredded rubber. "Whoa, that's a big one." Marcus didn't speak. He just looked from the tire to the trunk, then to the collection of useless tools Dimitri had laid out on a pristine cloth. His gaze was analytical, calm. He finally spoke, his voice softer than his brother's. "You got a patch kit?" Dimitri scoffed. "A patch kit? For this?" "The spare," Marcus clarified, his eyes not leaving Dimitri's. "If it's just a slow leak, we could patch it, fill it with a portable pump, get you to a real garage. Costello was intrigued. The boy hadn't asked for money. He hadn't postured. He had identified a problem and proposed a solution. It was the kind of thinking he paid his top executives millions for. "We don't have a kit or a pump," Costello stated, testing him. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to his brothers. A silent conversation passed between them. Jamal shrugged. Leo gave a slight nod. It was a board meeting conducted in the space of 2 seconds. "We got one at home," Marcus said. "It's not far. We can get it." Costello felt a sliver of suspicion, the instinct that had kept him alive and powerful for 30 years. They could take his money and vanish. But then he looked at Marcus again. The boy's eyes were old, carrying a weight that didn't belong on a 17-year-old. It was a look Costello recognized from his own mirror. "How much?" he asked, the words feeling crude on his tongue. A flicker of something, pride, maybe offense, crossed Marcus's face before it was smoothed away. "We're not asking for money, just helping out." He turned to his brothers. "Jamal, Leo, go get the kit. You know where Dad kept it." The 2 younger boys took off at a run, their worn sneakers slapping against the pavement. For 10 minutes, Costello and Marcus stood in an unlikely, silent truce. Dmitri paced nervously, speaking in low Russian into his phone. Costello leaned against the hot metal of his car, studying the boy who had chosen to remain. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't trying to make small talk. He was just present, watching the street with a placid stillness that was unnerving. "You know a lot about cars," Costello observed. Marcus finally looked at him. "My dad was a mechanic, taught us everything." The use of the past tense was subtle, but clear. "He's not around anymore?" Costello asked, a rare probe into another's life. "No, sir," Marcus said, and the quiet finality of his answer shut the door on any further questions. It was a boundary Costello, a master of boundaries, could respect. Jamal and Leo returned, panting, carrying a battered metal toolbox and a small, wheezing electric pump. For the next 20 minutes, the 3 brothers worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing. Jamal, the muscle, worked the lug wrench. Leo, small and nimble, located the puncture in the spare. Marcus, the surgeon, prepped the rubber and applied the patch with focused precision. They didn't bicker or argue. Each knew his role. They were a team. Costello watched, forgotten, as they inflated the patched spare, the little pump groaning in protest. They mounted it, tightened the nuts in a star pattern, and lowered the jack. Jamal wiped his greasy hands on his jeans. "Should hold you till you can get a new one." Costello reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick wad of cash. He peeled off 5 $100 bills and held them out to Marcus. Marcus looked at the money, then at Costello's face. He didn't move. "No, thank you, sir," Marcus said politely. "We were just helping." Costello's world was transactional. Favors were debts. Help had a price. This was an anomaly. "Don't be foolish, son. You earned it." "Give it to Leo," Marcus said, nodding at his youngest brother. "He's saving up for a new telescope." Costello looked at the youngest boy, whose eyes were wide as saucers. He handed the money to Leo, who took it with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "Thank you, sir." "Thank your brother," Costello said, his eyes back on Marcus. He took out a business card. "What's your name?" "Marcus." "Marcus," Costello repeated, committing it to memory. "You're a good man." He handed the card to him. "If you ever need anything, you call this number." Marcus took the card, glanced at it, and slipped it into his pocket without a word. The brothers gathered their tools, gave a collective nod, and walked away, resuming their journey home as if their encounter with one of the city's most powerful men was nothing more than a minor detour. Costello got into the car, the air conditioning a cold shock. As Dmitri drove away, carefully nursing the patched tire, Costello looked back at the three retreating figures. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time he would see them. The next morning, as Marcus was making breakfast for his brothers in their small, cramped apartment, a shadow fell across their window. He looked down to the street below. A black SUV, identical to the ones that often flanked Costello's sedan, was parked at the curb. Two men in dark suits got out. They didn't look like they were there to fix a tire. Jamal and Leo came to stand beside him, their breakfast forgotten. The three of them watched in silence as the men entered their building. A moment later, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through their apartment. Marcus looked at his brothers, his face a calm mask, but inside his heart had begun a slow, heavy drumbeat. He opened the door. One of the men was Dmitri. He offered no greeting. "Mr. Costello wants to see you." The ride to the Costello estate was a journey into another dimension. The city's familiar landscape of brick, concrete, and chain-link fences gradually gave way to manicured hedges, old-growth trees, and stone walls topped with wrought iron. The brothers sat in the plush leather seats of the SUV, a silent, formidable trio. Leo's face was pressed against the tinted window, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. Jamal sat ramrod straight, his arms crossed, a defiant fortress of teenage bravado. Marcus was still, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed forward. He was replaying the previous day's events, searching for a misstep, an offense he might have given. He found none. The quiet refusal of payment, the polite efficiency. It was how their father had taught them to conduct themselves. Be useful, be respectful, and expect nothing. Why, then, were they being summoned like errant schoolboys to the principal's office? The SUV passed through a set of immense iron gates and swept up a long, curving driveway. The house wasn't a house, it was a monument. A sprawling edifice of pale stone and dark glass that seemed to have been carved from the hillside itself. It was beautiful, but it was a cold, uninviting beauty, like a museum built to house a single, priceless tragedy. Dmitri led them through a cavernous foyer where their footsteps echoed on polished marble. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon oil and something else, something sterile and medicinal. They were shown into a vast study lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that looked as if they had never been read. Antonio Costello sat behind a desk the size of a small car, a monolith of dark, polished wood. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring at a bank of security monitors that displayed various angles of the house and grounds. "Sit," he commanded without turning around. The boys sat on a leather sofa that sighed under their weight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Costello was a master of using silence as a weapon, letting it unnerve and intimidate. Finally, he swiveled his chair to face them. His eyes, dark and piercing, assessed each of them in turn, lingering on Marcus. "Yesterday," he began, his voice calm and measured, "you demonstrated a capacity for problem-solving and a work ethic that is rare. You also demonstrated integrity." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "This city is full of traps for young men like you. The streets have a way of swallowing them whole." Jamal bristled. "We ain't in any trouble." Costello's gaze shifted to him, and the sheer intensity of it made Jamal visibly flinch. "I am not accusing you of being in trouble. I am stating a fact about the world you live in, a world I know very well." He looked back at Marcus. "I have a proposition for you. I own this estate. It requires a great deal of maintenance. I need a new groundskeeper's assistant. The work is simple. Gardening, maintenance, general upkeep. The pay is substantial. The position is for you, Marcus." Marcus was stunned into silence. A job? Here? It made no sense. "Why?" he asked, the single word cutting through the formality of the room. "Because I believe in rewarding competence," Costello said smoothly, "and because I believe it is better for a young man of your character to be working here in the open air than to be running the streets." It was an offer cloaked in benevolence, but Marcus could feel the steel beneath it. It was a command. Costello was taking him under his wing, whether he wanted to be there or not. It was a form of control, a payment for the debt of the flat tire, a debt Marcus hadn't even believed existed. But he also thought of the stack of unpaid bills on their kitchen counter, of the way his brother's sneakers were worn through at the soles, of the constant grinding worry that was his silent companion. This was a lifeline. "What about them?" Marcus asked, gesturing to Jamal and Leo. "I look after them." "They will be looked after," Costello said, a promise that sounded more like a verdict. "A car will bring you here each morning and take you home each evening. You start tomorrow." It was a dismissal. Dmitri materialized at the door to escort them out. As they walked back through the silent, echoing foyer, Marcus's eyes were drawn to a wide, curving staircase. At the top, a door was slightly ajar. For a fleeting second, he saw a woman in a crisp white nurse's uniform, and beyond her, a room bathed in the soft glow of medical monitors. He caught a glimpse of a small figure in a large bed, pale and still. Then the nurse noticed him looking and quickly, quietly, pulled the door shut. The image was seared into his mind, a secret, silent sorrow hidden in the heart of all this cold, empty grandeur. He didn't know it then, but he had just seen his true purpose for being there. It had nothing to do with gardening. The next morning, the black SUV was waiting for him, a sleek, silent promise. The job was, as Costello had said, simple. Marcus was assigned to a man named Sal, the head groundskeeper, a weathered Italian with hands like gnarled roots and a vocabulary that consisted mostly of grunts and nods. Sal pointed him toward a section of the estate that had been left to languish. A large Victorian-style greenhouse, its glass panes clouded with grime, its interior a tangled jungle of dead and dying exotic plants. "Start here," Sal grunted, handing him a pair of shears and a bucket. "Mr. Costello wants it cleared." It was hard, mindless work, and Marcus lost himself in it. He cut back desiccated vines, pulled up stubborn, thorny weeds, and filled bucket after bucket with the debris of long neglect. The greenhouse was at the back of the property, offering a clear view of the rear of the mansion. From this vantage point, he could see the window of the room he had glimpsed the day before. The curtains were always drawn. For the first few days, Marcus worked in solitude, his world reduced to the scent of damp earth and the satisfying ache in his muscles. He observed the rhythms of the house from a distance. He saw the nurses changing shifts, their faces grim and professional. He saw the daily arrival of a silver Jaguar, from which emerged a tall, silver-haired man with a doctor's bag. He saw Costello himself, a solitary figure who sometimes stood at a window in his study, staring out at the grounds without seeing them. But he never saw the child. The boy, Luca, was an invisible presence, a gravitational center around which the entire sorrowful house revolved. Marcus's quiet, diligent nature did not go unnoticed. Sal, initially taciturn, began to warm to him, offering him a bottle of water on a hot afternoon or sharing a piece of fruit from his own lunch. The household staff, a small army of maids and cooks, would smile and nod as he passed through the kitchens to wash his hands. He was an anomaly, not quite staff, not quite a guest, a quiet boy brought in under the strange patronage of the master of the house. He never asked questions. He just watched. He learned that the doctor's name was Finch, a man who had treated the Costello family for decades. He learned that the nurses worked in 12-hour shifts and were forbidden from speaking about their patient to anyone. He learned that the boy's name was Luca, and that he had not moved or spoken in the 2 years since the accident that had killed his mother, Elena. The official story was that he was in a persistent vegetative state, his brain catastrophically damaged. He was kept alive by machines and fed through a tube. It was a tragedy, they whispered in the kitchens, a cross that Mr. Costello had to bear. But Marcus, the observer, saw things that didn't fit the neat narrative of tragedy. One afternoon, while cleaning the exterior glass of the greenhouse, he looked up at Luca's window. For the first time, a sliver of the curtain was pulled back. He could see the bed, the machines, and the small, still form. As he watched, a monarch butterfly, orange and black, fluttered past the window. And Marcus saw it. A flicker. The boy's head, which he'd been told was always still, had made a minute, almost imperceptible turn, his eyes tracking the flight of the butterfly. It was there and gone in a second. A trick of the light, perhaps. A muscle spasm. But Marcus knew what he had seen. It was a moment of tracking, of focus. It was a sign of a mind still at work, locked inside a silent prison. This observation lit a small, dangerous fire of curiosity within him. He started to test his new, impossible hypothesis. His father had taught him and his brothers that every broken thing, whether it was an engine or a person, had a reason for being broken. You just had to be patient enough to find it. Marcus began to incorporate small, deliberate actions into his routine. When he worked near the house, he would whistle. Not a complex tune, but a simple, repeating 5-note melody that his mother used to hum when she was tending to her own small garden on their apartment balcony. It was a melody of peace and growth. He would whistle it as he trimmed the hedges beneath Luca's window, as he swept the stone patio. He expected nothing. He just put the sound out into the world, a seed of music planted in the sterile air. He also started bringing things from the greenhouse. He would find a perfect, unblemished camellia blossom and leave it on the outer sill of Luca's window. He found a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree, a perfect, intricate cup of twigs and moss, and placed it there too. They were silent offerings, messages to the boy he was not supposed to believe could receive them. He felt like a fool, and yet he couldn't stop. He was tending to 2 gardens now, the neglected greenhouse and the neglected boy. Slowly, painstakingly, both began to show signs of life. The greenhouse, cleared of debris and with its glass panes washed clean, began to feel like a sanctuary. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating the healthy plants that had survived the neglect. And Marcus felt a change in the house, too, a subtle shift in the energy. Or maybe, he thought, the change was only in him. The breakthrough came on a gray, overcast afternoon. A summer storm was rolling in, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain. Marcus was inside the now clean greenhouse, repotting a resilient orchid, when he saw one of the nurses open Luca's window a few inches to let in the fresh air before the downpour. It was a rare opportunity. The nurse left the room, leaving the door ajar. Acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, Marcus left the greenhouse and walked to the stone patio directly beneath the open window. He was shielded from view of the main house by a large stone pillar. He was alone. He took a deep breath and began to hum. Not whistling this time, but a low, resonant hum of the 5-note melody his mother had loved. He hummed it over and over, a gentle, looping lullaby. He poured all the quiet sorrow from his own life, the memory of his own lost mother, into the simple tune. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked up at the window, and he saw a hand, a small, pale hand, resting on the white bedsheet just inside the window. It had been limp and lifeless every other time he had seen it. But now, as he hummed, one finger began to twitch. It wasn't a spasm. It was a deliberate, rhythmic tap, tapping in perfect time with his melody. Tap, 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 tap. His breath caught in his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs. The boy could hear him. The boy was responding. It was real. Marcus knew with a certainty that transcended medical charts and expert opinions that Luca Costello was in there. He was trapped, but he was alive and aware. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, spattering on the stone around him, but Marcus didn't feel them. He just stared at the tapping finger, a tiny miraculous drumbeat signaling a profound and terrifying truth. He had just discovered a secret that could either save a life or cost him his own. The fragile hope was terrifying in its intensity. He knew he couldn't keep it to himself, but who would ever believe him? He was just the gardener's boy. The tapping finger became Marcus's obsession. It was a secret he carried with him, a warm, heavy stone in his pocket. For days he wrestled with what to do. To tell someone felt like a betrayal of the fragile, silent trust he had built with the boy in the window. To remain silent felt like a betrayal of Luca himself. He decided to push further, to gather more proof, something so undeniable it couldn't be dismissed as a muscle spasm or a trick of the light. He needed to get closer. The opportunity came a week later. There was a brief, chaotic period every afternoon around 3 o'clock when the day nurse's shift ended and the night nurse's began. For about 10 minutes, there was a handover, a flurry of chart-checking and conversation in the hallway. It was a small crack in the fortress of routine that surrounded Luca. Marcus had been observing it for weeks. On this day, he made his move. He had been sweeping the upstairs hallway, a task Sal had given him, allowing him legitimate access to the second floor. He waited, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, until he saw the two nurses conferring at the far end of the hall. The door to Luca's room was, as it often was during this transition, slightly ajar. Slipping off his worn work boots to silence his footsteps, he pushed the door open and slid inside. The room was a shock. It didn't feel like a bedroom, it felt like a command center for a failing mission. Machines blinked and beeped in a soft, monotonous chorus. The air was sterile, cold, and in the center of it all was Luca, looking smaller and paler than he did from a distance. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at the ceiling. A small, worn wooden wolf was clutched in his left hand, the only personal item in the sterile landscape. Marcus moved to the bedside, his every nerve alight. He was terrified of being discovered, of the consequences. But the sight of the boy, so alone in his mechanical prison, overrode his fear. "Luca," he whispered, the name feeling strange and powerful on his lips. There was no response. The boy's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. Marcus's heart sank. Had he imagined it all? Was this just wishful thinking? No. He remembered the tapping finger. He leaned closer. He didn't hum this time. He spoke, his voice low and steady. He told Luca about the greenhouse, about the orchid he had repotted, about how its roots had been tangled but strong. He told him about his brothers, Jamal and Leo, about a funny argument they'd had over breakfast. He spoke of simple, living things. He talked for maybe a minute, his words a quiet stream in the beeping silence. Then he reached into his pocket and took out 2 smooth gray stones he had picked up from the garden path. They were his own totem, something he carried to remind him of the solidness of the earth. He gently placed one of the stones in Luca's open right palm, closing the boy's cool fingers around it. Then he held the other stone in his own hand. He tapped a simple rhythm on the metal bed rail. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2. He waited, his breath held tight in his chest. Nothing. He did it again. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2. A single, crystalline tear escaped from the corner of Luca's eye and traced a silent path to his temple. And then it happened. A faint, barely audible sound. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Tap, tap. From inside Luca's closed fist, the stone had tapped against his palm, mimicking the rhythm perfectly. It was a conversation, a secret coded message sent from the deepest part of the abyss. Marcus felt a dizzying wave of vindication and terror. He had his proof. Before he could react further, he heard the nurses' voices grow louder in the hall. He quickly, gently retrieved his stone from Luca's hand, leaving the boy clutching his wooden wolf. He slipped out of the room as silently as he had entered, his heart pounding a wild, triumphant rhythm against his ribs. He was halfway down the hall when the door to the study opened and Antonio Costello stepped out. Costello's eyes, chips of black ice, locked onto Marcus. He took in the boy's stockinged feet, his proximity to Luca's room, the flush of adrenaline on his face. Costello's world was built on observation and the interpretation of subtle signs, and every sign told him something was wrong. "What are you doing up here?" His voice was dangerously soft. "Sweeping, sir," Marcus said, his own voice tight. "Sal asked me to do the upstairs hall." Costello's gaze flickered down the hall, then back to Marcus. He knew Sal's routines. Sal never assigned inside work. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Costello's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You were in my son's room." It was not a question. "Sir, Marcus began, but the words died in his throat. "Do not lie to me, boy," Costello snarled, stepping closer, his presence immense and suffocating. "I have cameras in every room, on every angle. I see everything that happens in this house." He gestured for Marcus to follow him, turning and striding back into his study. Marcus followed, his body numb with dread. Costello moved behind his massive desk and tapped a few keys on his computer. One of the monitors flickered to life, showing a high-angle, silent video of Luca's room. It showed Marcus entering, speaking, placing the stone in Luca's hand. It showed the tapping, and it showed the tear. Costello stared at the screen, his face unreadable. He rewound the footage and played it again. And again. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint whir of the computer. Marcus stood before the desk, waiting for the axe to fall. He expected yelling, accusations, being fired, being thrown out, or worse. What he got was far more unsettling. Antonio Costello, the unshakable titan, began to tremble. His broad shoulders shook, and he covered his face with his hands. A sound emerged from him, a raw, ragged sob that was torn from the depths of his soul. It was the sound of 2 years of iron control shattering into a million pieces. He wept, not with sadness, but with a terrifying, agonizing storm of hope and rage. He finally lowered his hands, his eyes red-rimmed and blazing with a terrifying new light. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Marcus finally found his voice. "I talked to him. I thought he was listening." "The doctors," they all said. Costello's voice trailed off. He looked from the screen to Marcus, his expression a maelstrom of confusion, suspicion, and a desperate, burgeoning faith. The confrontation he had expected had morphed into something else entirely. The conflict was not between them, but between the terrible accepted truth and the impossible thing he had just witnessed. He stood up, walked around the desk, and stood before Marcus. He was a father whose world had just been cracked open. "Show me," he commanded, his voice shaking with the force of his emotion. "Show me again. Now." The tentative secret alliance was born in that moment, forged in the fire of a father's broken heart and a quiet boy's unwavering belief. The walk back to Luca's room was the longest of Marcus's life. Costello strode ahead, a man possessed, while Marcus followed, the 2 smooth stones feeling heavy as lead in his pocket. The nurses, seeing their employer's thunderous expression, melted away into the shadows of the hallway. Costello entered the room first, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere from a sterile medical ward to a chamber of judgment. He stood by his son's bed, looking down at the small, still face, his own expression a raw mix of anguish and ferocious hope. "Do it," he ordered, his voice low and tight. Marcus approached the other side of the bed. He felt the weight of the moment, the crushing pressure of a father's desperate gamble. If Luca didn't respond now, Costello's fragile hope would turn to ash, and his wrath would be absolute. Marcus took a breath, centering himself. He looked at Luca, not as a medical case, but as the boy he knew was trapped inside. "Hey, Luca," he said softly, his voice calm despite the tremor in his hands. "It's Marcus. I'm back." He took one of the stones and placed it in Luca's palm, just as he had before. He held the other in his own. He looked at Costello, whose eyes were burning holes into him. Marcus tapped the rhythm on the bed rail. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Costello's face began to darken with disappointment and rage. Marcus felt a cold wave of despair wash over him. Maybe it had been a fluke, a coincidence. He was about to try again when Costello held up a hand, stopping him. He was looking at the heart monitor. The steady, metronomic beep had changed. The rhythm was faster. Beep, beep, beep. Pause. Beep, beep. Costello's eyes widened. He looked from the monitor to his son's hand. And then they both heard it. The faint, unmistakable tap, tap, tap from within Luca's fist. He had responded not with his hand, but with his heart. His body was communicating in the only way it could. Costello let out a strangled gasp and sank into the chair by the bedside. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on Luca's forehead, his touch infinitely gentle. "Luca," he whispered, the name a prayer. "My son." For the first time in 2 years, Antonio Costello was not looking at a tragedy. He was looking at his son. He turned his gaze to Marcus, and the gratitude in his eyes was so profound it was almost painful to see. The alliance was no longer tentative, it was sealed. That night, Costello dismissed the night nurse with a curt order to take the rest of the week off. When she was gone, he and Marcus sat in the quiet, blinking room, a silent vigil. Costello, a man who delegated everything, now began his own investigation. He started by talking. He told Marcus about Elena, his late wife. He spoke of her fire, her intelligence, her fierce love for Luca. He described the boy Luca had been before the accident, a whirlwind of energy and laughter, obsessed with animals and drawing. "He loved wolves," Costello said, his voice thick with memory, as he gently touched the small wooden wolf in Luca's hand. "Said they were strong and smart and looked after their family. Elena carved this for him." He then recounted the day of the accident. It was a rainy afternoon, much like this one. Elena was driving Luca to a drawing class. A truck ran a red light. The impact was on the passenger side. Elena was killed instantly. Luca suffered a severe head trauma. He'd been like this ever since. Dr. Finch was the first one at the hospital, Costello recalled, his brow furrowed in concentration. He took charge of everything, said the damage was catastrophic. He's been managing Luca's care from day one. As Costello spoke, a new kind of energy filled him. The passive grief that had defined him was being replaced by an active, urgent need for answers. If the doctors were wrong about Luca's condition, what else were they wrong about? "I want to see her things," he said suddenly, standing up. "Elena's. I had it all packed away. I couldn't bear to look at it." He led Marcus to a locked room at the end of the hall. It was Elena's study. Her scent, a faint mix of jasmine and old books, still lingered in the air. Boxes were stacked against the walls, a mausoleum of a life interrupted. Costello pried one open with a letter opener. It was filled with books. He opened another. Clothes. A third held photo albums. He and Marcus spent hours sifting through the memories. Then, at the bottom of a box filled with sketch pads and art supplies, Marcus found it. It was a leather-bound journal. "This was hers," Costello said, his voice reverent. He took the journal and opened it. Elena's elegant script filled the pages. For the first hour, he read passages aloud, funny anecdotes about Luca, loving complaints about her husband's long work hours, notes about her garden. Then his voice faltered. He fell silent, his eyes scanning the pages with a growing intensity. He began to read from a section dated the month before the accident. "Alistair is insisting on a new vitamin regimen for Luca," he read, his voice tight. "Says his iron is low. I don't like it. Luca seems more tired since he started. Less himself. Alistair was so dismissive when I mentioned it. Told me not to play doctor." Costello's knuckles were white as he gripped the journal. He flipped forward a few pages. "Met with the accountants from the Children's Foundation today," he read, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are discrepancies, large ones. Money going to a research company I've never heard of. When I looked it up, the address was just a P.O. box. Alistair is on the board. He signs off on all the grants. I'm going to talk to him about it tomorrow. He's going to be furious." Costello looked up from the journal, his face pale, a terrible, dawning horror in his eyes. The last entry was dated the day before the crash. She was going to confront him, Costello whispered. The air in the room grew cold and heavy. The accident, the unshakable diagnosis, the 2 years of silence, it all began to coalesce into a shape, a monstrous and deliberate architecture of deceit. The key artifact had been found, and it pointed not toward a tragic accident, but toward something far more sinister. The journal changed everything. It was a voice from the grave, and its message was a chilling accusation. Antonio Costello, a man accustomed to wielding power, now turned that power inward, focusing the full force of his intellect and resources on the single, terrifying question of what had truly happened to his wife and son. The grief that had paralyzed him for 2 years had been transmuted into a cold, diamond-hard rage. He and Marcus became a secret, 2-man investigation team operating within the walls of the silent mansion. During the day, Marcus tended to the greenhouse, his cover intact, but his real work was with Luca. With Costello's blessing, he spent hours in the boys' room every afternoon. He talked, he hummed, he used the stones. Luca's responses grew stronger. The tapping became more consistent. Sometimes his eyes would clearly track Marcus as he moved around the room. It was a slow, painstaking process, like coaxing a single, fragile shoot from frozen ground. Costello, meanwhile, began to dig. He worked from his study, the doors locked, his phone calls now encrypted, and his meetings held with a new discreet team of private investigators, men who owed their loyalty to him and him alone. He tasked them with a single objective, to dissect the life of Dr. Alistair Finch. He wanted to know everything, his finances, his associates, his history. He also ordered them to find the original police report and accident reconstruction from the crash. He wanted a fresh, unbiased look at the evidence. While the external investigation churned, Costello and Marcus focused on what they could find within the house. Costello remembered a safe in his main office, a place where he and Elena kept important documents. Dr. Finch had helped him clear it out after her death, sorting the paperwork while Costello was numb with grief. Finch had insisted on taking all of Luca's medical files to his own office for safekeeping and consolidation. It had seemed a kindness at the time. Now it seemed like the act of a thief covering his tracks. "He didn't get everything," Costello said one night, his eyes alight with a grim thought. Elena was meticulous. She kept copies. She never trusted anyone with the only copy of anything important. They returned to Elena's sealed study and began a systematic search. They went through every box, every book, every file folder. It was Marcus who found the anomaly. Tucked inside a heavy art history textbook was a thin manila envelope. It was labeled simply L copies. Inside were photocopies of Luca's medical records from birth until the month of the accident. It included blood tests, developmental assessments, and checkup notes. On the surface, they seemed normal. "What are we looking for?" Marcus asked, spreading the papers across Elena's old desk. "I don't know," Costello admitted. "A difference, something that Finch's version of the story leaves out." The problem was, they didn't have Finch's version. The official records were locked, away in the doctor's office. Getting them would alert him, and they couldn't risk that. The stalemate lasted for 2 days. The answer, when it came, was provided by Luca himself. Marcus was in the room with him, practicing their rhythmic communication. He was tapping out the names of animals. A short tap for wolf, 2 long ones for horse. Luca was responding, his finger tapping against the wooden wolf he always held. Suddenly, Luca's breathing hitched. The heart monitor, which Marcus now watched as closely as any nurse, spiked erratically. A faint gurgling sound came from Luca's throat. He was in distress. Marcus hit the nurse call button, and within seconds, Dr. Finch himself swept into the room, the on-duty nurse trailing behind him. Finch's face was a mask of professional concern. "What happened?" he snapped, pushing Marcus aside to get to the bed. "He was fine, and then—" Marcus stammered. Finch ignored him. He checked Luca's vitals, listened to his chest with a stethoscope, and administered a small injection from a vial he carried. Luca's breathing evened out, the monitor returning to its steady rhythm. "It's a minor seizure," Finch said, his voice smooth and reassuring, but his eyes, when they glanced at Marcus, were cold. "A sad but expected part of his condition. His system is fragile." He made a note on the digital chart by the bed, his movements efficient and practiced. After he left, a thought struck Marcus. The digital chart. Finch had just updated it. Costello had access to the entire household's digital network. That night, Costello used his master credentials to access the live medical chart. He downloaded the entire file, a complete record of every diagnosis, treatment, and medication Luca had received since the accident. Now they had both sets of records, Elena's copies from before the crash and Finch's official file from after. They spread the printouts across the massive desk in Costello's study. For hours they compared them, line by line. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The post-accident records were a grim litany of therapies and medications designed to manage the symptoms of a catastrophic brain injury. Then Marcus saw it. It was on one of the first blood tests Elena had copied. A small, handwritten note in her own script next to Luca's iron levels. Allergic to ferinitral. Below it, in parentheses, causes severe respiratory distress. Marcus looked up at Costello. "What's ferinitral?" Costello typed the name into his computer. It was a component in a number of complex iron supplements. He cross-referenced it with the list of medications on Luca's current chart. And there it was, a core component of the daily vitamin regimen Dr. Finch had prescribed and administered for 2 years. He wasn't just giving Luca something he was allergic to, he was giving him something that Elena had specifically noted was dangerous for him. But that wasn't the central reveal. The true horror was yet to come. One of Costello's investigators called. He had gotten his hands on Dr. Finch's private financial records. As Costello listened, his face turned to stone. The foundation money Elena had been suspicious of was just the tip of the iceberg. Finch had been systematically embezzling from Costello for years, funneling money through a shell corporation that manufactured experimental pharmaceuticals. And then came the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The investigator had found a series of large, untraceable purchases made by that same shell corporation in the weeks leading up to the accident. The purchases were for a specific set of chemical precursors. When combined, they formed a compound known as tetrodotoxin B7, an obscure, custom-synthesized neurotoxin. It was a poison designed to mimic the symptoms of a massive stroke or brain trauma. It was slow-acting, difficult to detect, and its effects could be sustained with small, regular doses. Doses that could easily be hidden in a daily vitamin regimen. The truth crashed down on them with the force of a physical blow. Finch had poisoned Luca before the accident, causing the seizure that made Elena crash the car. He had killed Elena to silence her, and he had kept Luca in a chemically induced coma ever since, making it look like a permanent vegetative state. It was a lie of unimaginable cruelty, all to cover up his greed. The antagonist was unmasked, his motive laid bare. He wasn't just a thief, he was a monster hiding in plain sight, a trusted friend who had become the architect of all their pain. The revelation that Dr. Finch was not a healer but a poisoner sent a tremor through the foundations of Antonio Costello's world. Every memory of the past 2 years was now tainted, every word of comfort from the doctor now a venomous lie. The grief for his wife was sharpened by a new incandescent rage, and his concern for his son became a desperate, urgent crusade. But they had to be careful. Finch was clever, embedded in their lives, and held all the medical authority. A direct accusation without ironclad, legally admissible proof would be dismissed as the ravings of a grieving father. Finch could simply sedate Luca further, perhaps permanently, to hide his crime. They were moving against a man who held their son's life in his hands. Their first priority was to get Luca off the poison. Costello, using the information about the ferinitrile allergy as a pretext, informed Finch that he was bringing in a new team of specialists for a second opinion, a common enough request for a wealthy family. He framed it as a desperate measure, an act of a father refusing to give up hope. Finch, ever the smooth manipulator, agreed with a show of weary sympathy. "Of course, Tony," he'd said over the phone, his voice oozing compassion. "Anything that gives you a measure of peace. But I must caution you against false hope. We don't want to disturb Luca unnecessarily." The new medical team was not from a random hospital. They were hand-picked by Costello's security chief, flown in from a private clinic in Switzerland, their loyalty bought and paid for. Their official purpose was consultation. Their real purpose was to discreetly get a pure, untainted sample of Luca's blood and tissue and to replace his IV drip with a simple saline solution, flushing the toxins from his system. The switch was made in the dead of night, with Marcus standing guard at the door. He watched as the new doctor, a quiet, efficient woman named Dr. Eris, expertly drew the blood and made the change. For the first time in 2 years, Luca's body was free from the chemical shackles that had bound it. The effect was almost immediate. Within 24 hours, the slight gray pallor of Luca's skin was replaced by a healthier, more natural tone. His resting heart rate, which had always been sluggish, became stronger and more regular. The changes were subtle, but to Marcus and Costello, who had spent weeks studying every nuance of the boy's condition, they were monumental. It was working. They were winning. But their clandestine activities had not gone unnoticed. Dr. Finch was no fool. He had eyes and ears throughout the household staff, people who owed him favors or feared his influence. The arrival of a foreign medical team, the locked doors of the study, Costello's newly intense and watchful demeanor, it all added up to a threat. Finch must have suspected his long deception was unraveling, and he retaliated, not with a direct confrontation, but with a cruel, calculated strike designed to cripple them by removing their most important asset. Marcus? The attack came on a sunny Friday afternoon. Marcus was in the greenhouse, humming to himself as he watered the orchids, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in a long while. He heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway and looked up to see not one of Costello's black SUVs, but 2 police cars and a plain sedan from the Department of Child and Family Services. A woman in a severe suit and 2 uniformed officers approached him. The woman, Miss Albright, held a file and addressed him by name. "Marcus Cole?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. "We've received a report, An anonymous tip concerning the welfare of you and your brothers. Marcus's blood ran cold. What kind of report? A report alleging neglect, she said, her eyes scanning his work clothes, the dirt under his fingernails. It claims your home environment is unstable, that you are being exploited in an inappropriate work situation with a known organized crime figure, and that your younger brothers are often left unsupervised. Every word was a perfectly crafted dagger. Finch had used Costello's own fearsome reputation as a weapon against them. To an outsider, a teenage boy from the inner city suddenly living under the patronage of a man like Antonio Costello looked suspicious, even sinister. It was a brilliant, vicious move. While the police questioned Marcus, a separate team was dispatched to his apartment, where Jamal and Leo were home from school. They were questioned, the apartment searched, their lives turned upside down. Later that day, Marcus was brought before Ms. Albright in an impersonal office downtown. Costello was there, flanked by a team of lawyers, his face a mask of thunderous rage. But the system, once set in motion, was a ponderous beast. Ms. Albright was unmoved by his power. "Mr. Costello," she said, her tone icy, "your reputation precedes you, and frankly, it only lends credence to the allegations. Until our investigation is complete, a temporary restraining order has been issued. Marcus Cole is not to have any contact with you or to be present on your property. Furthermore, we are placing his brothers in temporary protective custody." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Leo and Jamal separated from him. The thought was unbearable. It was the one thing he had sworn to his mother he would never let happen. Costello's lawyers argued, threatened, and cajoled, but Ms. Albright held firm. The system was designed to protect children, and on paper, Marcus and his brothers looked like children in peril. As a final venomous twist, one of the officers produced a small, evidence-bagged vial. "This was found in your locker in the staff area of the Costello estate," he said to Marcus. "It's a powerful sedative, the same type used to treat Mr. Costello's son." Finch hadn't just called social services. He had planted evidence, framing Marcus for theft, painting him as a danger to Luca. The crisis was absolute. Marcus was separated from his brothers, and crucially, from Luca. Costello was legally barred from helping him. Finch had successfully cut the head off their investigation and isolated his victim once more. Back at the mansion, Luca felt the absence of Marcus like a physical amputation. The humming, the tapping, the quiet voice. It was all gone. The new nurses were kind but clinical. His father was a storm of frantic energy, always on the phone. The one constant comforting presence in his silent world had vanished. The boy, who had been on the precipice of a great awakening, began to slide back into the darkness. His responses faded. The light in his eyes dimmed. He was regressing, and Finch, watching from a distance, was surely smiling. The restraining order was a wall of paper and bureaucracy, but Antonio Costello was a man who knew how to demolish walls. While Marcus was temporarily placed in a youth home, a clean but soulless facility that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, Costello unleashed the full, terrifying force of his wealth and influence. The first 24 hours were a blur of legal maneuvering. His lawyers filed emergency motions, challenging every aspect of the DCFS order. They painted Ms. Albright as an overzealous bureaucrat blinded by Costello's public persona, ignoring the mountains of evidence of his care for the Cole brothers, the school tuition he had paid, the new clothes, the well-stocked pantry he had arranged for them. Simultaneously, he went on the offensive against Finch. He couldn't use the poisoning accusation yet, it was his trump card, but he could attack the man's character and credibility. His private investigators, who had been digging for weeks, had unearthed a treasure trove of filth. Dr. Finch, the respected physician, had a secret life. Gambling debts, a string of malpractice complaints that had been quietly settled and sealed, and most damnably, a sworn affidavit from a former nurse who claimed Finch had pressured her to falsify patient records for insurance fraud years ago. Costello's team tracked her down in another state and flew her in. While the lawyers fought in court, Marcus sat in the sterile common room of the youth home, his mind a whirlwind of fear for his brothers. He felt powerless, a pawn in a game played by kings. But he still had one move to make. During his one permitted phone call, he didn't call his brothers, or even Costello. He called Sal, the old groundskeeper. "Sal," he said, his voice low and urgent, "the greenhouse, the big orchid, the one by the west wall. There's a loose stone in the floor beneath it. Under the stone is a metal box. I need you to get it to Mr. Costello. Don't let anyone see you." It was a long shot. The box contained Marcus's personal treasures, a photo of his mother, his father's old mechanic's license, and a small, cheap digital audio recorder. Before he had ever dared to enter Luca's room, he had spent a week humming and whistling outside the window, and on a whim he had recorded it. He had also recorded the sound of the tapping finger, holding the recorder up to the open window one afternoon. It was faint, distorted by the wind, but it was there. It was his own, private proof. Sal, a man of few words but deep loyalty, simply said, "I'll do it, son," and hung up. The evidence mounted. Costello's lawyers presented the judge with financial records showing Marcus had been paid a generous official salary, not exploited. They produced school attendance records showing Jamal and Leo had not missed a single day. The frame-up charge for the stolen sedative began to crumble when Costello's head of security provided time-stamped footage showing another staff member, a gardener known to have a gambling problem and deep debts to one of Finch's bookies, entering the locker room minutes before the police arrived. The man was brought in for questioning and quickly confessed to planting the vial in exchange for having his debts cleared. The case against Marcus was falling apart. The turning point came when Sal delivered the small metal box. Costello listened to the audio recording. It was the missing link. It wasn't just his word or a grainy video. It was audible proof of communication, recorded days before Costello himself was aware of it. It demonstrated that Marcus's connection with Luca was genuine and predated any possible accusation of manipulation. Armed with this, Costello's lawyers went back to the judge. They played the recording in the closed courtroom. They presented the evidence of the frame-up. They submitted the affidavit from the ex-nurse about Finch's history of fraud. The restraining order was lifted. The charges against Marcus were dropped. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, his brothers waiting for him, their reunion a fierce, silent hug. But their fight wasn't over. It was time to set the trap for Finch. Costello, Marcus, and the Swiss doctor Aris devised the plan. Dr. Aris's team had analyzed Luca's blood work. The results were conclusive. It showed not only the presence of the complex neurotoxin, but also trace markers that proved it had been administered consistently over a long period. They had the scientific proof. Now they needed a confession. Costello arranged a meeting with Dr. Finch at the mansion. The pretext was urgent and grim. Luca had suffered a massive relapse, and the new specialists were recommending he be moved to a permanent hospice facility. It was the end game, Costello explained over the phone, his voice laced with expertly feigned despair. He needed Finch there to sign off on the transfer, to be there for him as a friend. Finch, believing he had won, that Marcus was neutralized and Costello was finally broken, agreed immediately. He arrived at the mansion that evening, his face a perfect sculpture of solemn sympathy. "Tony, I am so sorry," he said, placing a hand on Costello's shoulder. "I warned you that false hope could be cruel. We did everything we could." Costello led him not to Luca's room, but to the grand study. The room was dimly lit. Marcus was standing by the fireplace. Finch's composure flickered for a fraction of a second when he saw the boy. "What is he doing here?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "He's a witness," Costello said, his own voice dropping its mournful tone, replaced by the flat, cold deadliness of a serpent. He gestured for Finch to sit. "We have a great many things to discuss, Alistair." The confrontation began. Costello laid it all out, piece by piece, with the cold precision of a prosecutor. He started with the foundation, the embezzled money, Elena's journal. Finch paled but blustered, denying everything. "Grief is making you paranoid, Tony. These are wild, baseless accusations." Then Costello played Marcus's audio recording, the humming and the faint but clear responsive tapping. Finch's face tightened. "A coincidence. Sounds from the house." Costello then produced the sworn statement from the nurse who'd confessed to the frame-up. He showed Finch the bank records linking him to the gardener's bookie. Finch began to sweat. The final blow came when Dr. Arris walked into the room, holding a tablet. On the screen was the full toxicology report. "This is your son's blood work, Mr. Costello," she said, her voice clear and steady, though she addressed her words to Finch. "It shows lethal sustained levels of tetrodotoxin B7, a poison. We have already sent a copy to the district attorney's office." Finch stared at the screen, his mask of civility finally cracking, revealing the panicked, cornered animal beneath. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. You can't prove a thing. It's my word, the word of a respected physician, against a quack and a delinquent child." "It's not just their word, Alistair," Costello said softly. He pressed a button on his desk. A section of the bookshelf slid away, revealing a large screen. On it, Luca appeared, Liv, from his room upstairs. He was sitting up in bed, propped by pillows. He looked weak but alert. His eyes were clear. And next to him, holding his hand, was Leo, Marcus's youngest brother, who had been brought to the mansion to comfort Luca after Marcus was taken away. "We have one more witness," Costello said. In the video feed, Marcus, watching from across the room, spoke clearly. "Luca, can you show Dr. Finch what you showed me?" On the screen, Luca slowly, deliberately lifted his hand. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes filled with a child's simple, damning clarity. He extended his index finger and pointed directly at the study, directly at the man who had stolen 2 years of his life. It was a silent, devastating accusation. Finch stared, his mouth agape. His empire of lies had crumbled around him. He made a desperate lunge for the door, but it swung open before he reached it, revealing 2 grim-faced detectives and Dmitri, who looked on with cold satisfaction. "Alistair Finch," one of the detectives said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Elena Costello and the attempted murder of Luca Costello." As they led him away in handcuffs, a whimpering, broken man, Finch's final pathetic gaze fell on Marcus. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred for the quiet boy who had seen through it all. The battle was over. Vindication was absolute. In the study, Costello walked over to Marcus and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. There were no words needed. Upstairs, in his room, Luca watched the police cars pull away. He then turned his head and gave his father, watching on the monitor, the faintest, most beautiful smile. The arrest of Dr. Alistair Finch was a media sensation, a lurid tale of greed, betrayal, and high society murder that dominated the news for months. The trial was a formality. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, the toxicology reports, the financial trail, the damning testimony of his accomplice, and finally a videotape deposition from a recovering Luca Costello, Finch was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The world saw the verdict as the closing chapter of a tragedy. But for the residents of the sprawling stone mansion, it was the first page of a new story. With the poison gone from his system and the oppressive presence of Finch lifted, Luca's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. It began with smiles and nods, then progressed to single words, whispered at first, then spoken with growing confidence. His physical therapy was grueling, but he attacked it with a quiet determination that reminded everyone of his father. Marcus was his constant companion. They spent their afternoons in the greenhouse, which had become a vibrant sanctuary of life and color. It was there, surrounded by the orchids Marcus had so carefully nurtured, that Luca took his first halting steps, his hand clutching Marcus's for support. The bond between them was the scaffolding upon which Luca rebuilt his life. Antonio Costello also underwent a profound transformation. The cold, remote patriarch was gone, replaced by a man who was learning, clumsily but earnestly, how to be a father. He left the office early. He canceled international trips. He learned to listen, not just to his son, but to the 3 boys who had become an inextricable part of his life. He never tried to replace their father, but he became their fiercest protector, their most ardent champion. He moved the Cole brothers out of their cramped apartment and into a comfortable house on a quiet, tree-lined street not far from his estate, insisting that their education was his responsibility now. He was paying back a debt that had nothing to do with a flat tire, a debt of life and hope that he knew he could never fully repay. Jamal, his protective instincts now channeled, found his calling on the high school debate team, his sharp mind and sharper tongue making him a formidable opponent. Leo got his telescope, a professional-grade instrument that Costello had installed in a custom-built observatory on the estate grounds. He and Luca would spend hours under the stars, 2 boys rediscovering the wonders of a universe that one had been denied for too long. Marcus, the quiet observer, found his voice. The simple melodies he had hummed for Luca blossomed into a passion for music. Seeing this, Costello converted one of the mansion's many unused parlors into a music room, filling it with a grand piano, guitars, and recording equipment. Marcus discovered he had a gift for composition, for creating melodies that could soothe and heal. He knew with a quiet certainty that he wanted to study music therapy, to use his gift to help other children who were trapped in silence. A year after the trial, Costello hosted a gala. It wasn't one of his usual corporate affairs, but the inaugural event for the new Elena Costello Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to advocating for the victims of medical malpractice and fraud. The ballroom was filled with the city's elite, but the guests of honor were a small, unconventional family who sat at the front table. Costello, looking more at ease in a tuxedo than he ever had before, gave the opening speech. He spoke of his wife's integrity, her fierce desire for truth. He spoke of betrayal and loss, and then he spoke of hope. Hope can come from the most unexpected of places, he said, his eyes finding Marcus in the audience. It can come from an act of simple kindness on the side of a road. It can come from a young man who refuses to believe in the impossible, who listens when no one else will. The final part of the evening was a musical performance. The spotlight fell on the grand piano on stage. Luca, dressed in a small, sharp suit, walked confidently to the bench and sat down. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes clear and bright. He took a deep breath, and then his small fingers began to move across the keys. He played a simple 5-note melody, the one Marcus had hummed outside his window. He played it with a clear, resonant beauty that filled the vast ballroom, a testament to his resilience, a hymn to his rescuer. As the final note hung in the air, the room erupted in applause. At the front table, Costello put his arm around Marcus's shoulders. Jamal clapped loudly, a wide grin on his face, and Leo looked toward the stage with open admiration. They were a strange and wonderful sight. The feared tycoon, the recovering child, and the 3 boys from the other side of town. They were not a family born of blood, but one forged in crisis, bound by loyalty, and healed by the quiet courage of an unlikely hero. True wealth, Costello finally understood, was not measured in stock portfolios or sprawling estates, but in the fierce, protective love of a family you would do anything to defend. Before we say goodbye, we want to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the story. And please leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It means the world to us to know where our stories are reaching.